The Universal Spiderweb by Armando Torres. Forward by J.Y. It has already been many years since I'd heard anything from Armando. I was certain about going to visit him because the last time we met, he said, "Don't look for me, I'll look for you." I resigned myself to waiting, and I did my best to fulfill his requirement. But after all these years without any news, I decided to visit the old town where he lived. I knew that it was very unlikely to find him there, but at least I hoped to meet some of his acquaintances. I searched in one of the houses where I knew that they have something to do with the healers. They told me that I should go to see Pedro. I knew who they were talking about. He lived in a mud house outside of town. When I got there, I met his wife, who said that her husband had something for me, but that he was not home at the moment, that he had gone to the cornfield and I had to wait for him. The house had been changed. They added a kitchen made of concrete blocks to the small mud room. I sat to wait under a lemon tree. The woman was busy with her work. Then all of a sudden she came out, grabbed a fat chicken that barely made a sound, put it over the sink, and without hesitation she cut its head off, all in less than a minute. I felt shocked, but said nothing. We casually talked about trivialities like the weather, fashion, and Indian styles. When I tried to ask about Armando and his friends, she said that it would be better if I talked about this with her husband. When he arrived, he greeted me with pleasure, then invited me in, and said he had something for me and went to the other room. I could hear him searching. My curiosity was at its peak when he returned with a bag from a leg of an old pair of jeans, which had a carrying strap for transport and a loop closing it. When he handed it to me, he said that it was from Armando. I asked him about the content, and he replied with a facial gesture that it was obvious he didn't know. He added that he had kept the bag for me all these years, but he had never opened it. It's interesting to note how much modern people have lost the respect for privacy of others. Just as the film industry has corrupted the moral value of people, the internet has corrupted the value and respect for privacy. Not too long ago, privacy of correspondence was a sacred matter. No one even thought about the possibility of opening a letter that was not meant for them. Full of curiosity, I opened the bag. Inside, it was the manuscript of this, his new book. When I asked about Armando, he told me that he had gone with his friends. I knew what he meant, but I pretended not to understand, and asked him if they now lived in Veracruz or elsewhere. He didn't want to give me more details, and changed the subject. Armando never ceases to surprise me. Once he visited me in a dream, and told me things that later turned out to be true. I didn't believe he would publish anything else after his last book, The Secret of the Feathered Serpent. And now he comes out with these new and disconcerting revelations. As I read the manuscript, which was all out of order, I came across themes that shook me to the ground. The major difficulty was that the manuscript was indeed parts of several unfinished works. In this offering, he makes the world of the Nahuals much more understandable by revealing details of their behavior, beliefs, and traditions. At this point, I would like to mention a talk I once had with Armando. I argued that traditions, while helpful, can also be a big hindrance. I told him that, and I still believe it. In my opinion, all traditions, whatever they are mental, energetic, and even physical chains, since on many occasions they force people to behave like idiots. If you don't believe me, just look around and see the way that different traditions say their believers must dress. We have all these hierarchies: Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Muslim, etc., each defending their flag. They kill each other over their ideological disputes, and I think it would be impartial of me if in that ball I don't include sorcerers and shamans. I remember how Castaneda sometimes began to sing mockingly the chanting of the shamans, and openly said that they were all a bunch of morons. After knowing them and seeing what they do, one realizes that they are trapped in their traditions and rituals, just like everyone else. How can we solve this problem? As objective researchers, we can only be honest with ourselves and apply the method of elimination through recognition and comparison. For me, after how things seemed for my life, I decided to break away from all kinds of traditions. Maybe the only thing I borrowed is the method of experimentation. I only believe in what I experience by myself. All the rest are, for me, just tales of power. It's true that some traditions help to keep one in good physical shape, take care of one's health, and help one to maintain mental and energetic balance. But my argument here is that one can do the same on one's own. Through discipline and willpower, one can draw from each system only what is convenient for oneself, and this way avoid ideological commitments. Thus, one is free. Traditions demand a high price from us in exchange for the guidance and benefits they grant. They steal our freedom. Hence, we only have the rigid way of thinking and acting in accordance with these structures or traditions. As I said, some even have to go out to proclaim their faith, dressed up in ridiculous clothes and ornaments. How valid can anything be if it builds nothing, does nothing, and doesn't make you happy? Nevertheless, we only have to keep quiet and respect the ways of others, even when we disagree with their ideas. In this race, each one bets on their own horse. In this game of beliefs and methods, we place our stake on life and our freedom, which is why it's so imperative to choose wisely. Since we are betting everything on everything, with respect for the struggle of others, this is the only worthy measure of behavior, not only for warriors, but for anyone. I have a great respect for the simplicity of Armando and his friends, even though some of them turned out to be too fanatical to my taste. In my opinion, nothing good comes out of fanaticism. I know this because I have seen how many religious people convert to Nahualism as if it were one more religion. They continue with the same patterns learned, pleading, discussing, and proclaiming their new faith. It's like they have the necessity to confirm their beliefs by trying to convince others. It's a real pity to see how these fanatics make so much noise on forums and social networks. I've heard commentaries of serious people and beginners who are trying to search for information about the subject. And when they see such scandals online, they end up believing that this is Nahualism. As a consequence, they decide to abandon the search. The fanatics act in this way without considering that their actions not only bring disgrace to the name they inherited from their fathers, but acting that way, they move away from the spirit. The reality is that due to the need to attract attention, these fanatics make such public demonstrations of their blatantly overblown egos that in the end, they remain like the perches in a chicken coop, because the way they present themselves is how they will be remembered for posterity. When I commented to Armando about these behavioral aspects of some of his friends, he said that one cannot judge anybody for doing his impeccable best. I didn't like his answer, but said nothing. I was silent for a long time. It was true there was no reason to judge others. However, I was not satisfied. I was still ruminating on the matter. I wanted to argue, and it was then that I felt a snap in my head. It was like someone had turned on a light in front of my eyes. I understood that not caring about what others do or don't do is an effective way to save tons of energy. I practiced it since then the best I could, and I can attest that it really works. However, I've also found that this procedure has a collateral effect. I talked about this with Armando, and he confirmed that if taken to its furthest extreme, This practice inevitably leads one to isolate himself, which implies being alone. He also said that, on the other hand, the advantage is that it accelerates the process of losing the human form. He warned me that whenever this happens, it would be better to forget the world, because then it becomes even more difficult to have or maintain a relationship with people. On another occasion, I expressed my opinion that the sorcerer who decides to publish his experiences as Carlos did, or as he himself was doing, must be prepared to be attacked and to serve as an object of mockery by those who don't know anything about this, since for those who have not lived these experiences, the stories could sound like lies. He shook his head, showing his agreement with me, and said that only those who succeeded in detaching a minimum from their self-image and achieved a moment of inner silence could understand. He added, referring to the books, that no effort was ever in vain. Surely many seeds would fall on rocky ground, but some others would fall on fertile soil. And if the message serves to help at least one person, then all the effort is worth it. Another theme I talked about with him was how some are lucky to be a part of a group of sorcerers, or family as they call them, while others are doomed to be solitary birds, maybe forever. I said this in a somewhat complaining tone, even with some resentment. He laughed and threatened to punch me. He made a joke that I understood very well. I think that the loss of the human form is what makes sorcerers the way they are. I even wrote a poem to try to express that feeling. Wandering and lonely bird that pursues the impossible dream, no matter the distance it has to fly. This happened at a time when I thought I had lost my opportunity to belong to the world of the Nahual. It was then that Armando advised me to take responsibility for my own struggles. That's what I have been doing since then, taking responsibility for my decisions, and it has helped me to take control of my life. However, the signs didn't appear, and so I kept following my path as a lonely bird. Consistent with my word, I invested my own resources to publish the books. I'm honestly trying to make of this a profession from which I could survive, but with no success. In addition, this work has cost me endless attacks. There are those who think that it's my obligation to give away the work of the authors. Maybe in the past, the publication of books was a good deal, but today, with the distribution of unauthorized copies, the authors are almost literally starving. A large number of publishers have been closed, and piracy has effectively put the book industry on the brink of extinction. If this trend continues, it will be as Castaneda once predicted. In the near future, the only thing we will have will be the superfluous books written by computers and that are sold like hotcakes in airports and self-service stores. I think that only those who manage to reach a certain level of consciousness will not accept piracy. Lately, inspired by the books I published, I have dedicated myself to giving lectures and courses for those who are interested in experimenting. That seems to offend some people. Maybe they believe that I should do it for free. The truth is that I do what I am doing in an attempt to stay linked to the world of the Nahual. I know from my own experience how easy it is to get lost in the labyrinths of life. One assumes commitments that can divert one from the search for freedom, and then one realizes that one is sunken up to the neck in the swamp of everyday life, with family and dogs to take care of, and with no hope of getting out. The lack of necessary supervision in the different stages of this path entails the great disadvantage, which is the risk of dying during some very intense experience. I have learned this by paying a very high price. The danger is real. If one has to follow this path, he must be aware that the possibility of death is very real. On the other hand, however, there is the great advantage that by seeking information and knowledge for oneself, what I call taking responsibility for one's own path, frees one from the idiosyncrasies of the teachers who in many cases demand to be treated as divine beings, and here the same story is repeated again. I know that it's possible to do everything by oneself. All that we need are those steel balls that Carlos frequently mentioned. It's a matter of making a decision. If you want, you can learn through books or any other means, and then decide to act. In great measure, I've turned away from people because my desire to help others put me in serious trouble more than once. My mistake was not to consider that what was good for me was not always good for others. And if I think about it, most of the time my desire to help was only a reflection of my personal importance. I recognize that I still have a long way to go, and I feel as if I no longer have time. Old age is arriving, and one is still in the middle of the desert. Sometimes I find myself behaving like an idiot, as if I had all the time in the world. That's when that feeling of urgency that Armando talks about in this book hits home. The internal work never ends. When one goal is reached, a new challenge immediately appears. I hope that this work will help the friends who are on the path to get infected with the urgency of the Nahual and manage to make the decision to act and thus overcome themselves. In my opinion, we have received a magnificent gift with this new book by Armando Torres. Introduction. For those who are unfamiliar with my previous work, my name is Armando Torres. I'm a messenger and a witness. To relate fully what I have learned in the years of contact with a group of sorcerer healers and their descendants is my task. At the time of our first encounter, they lived in a small town in the mountains of central Mexico. My encounter with these healers was not at all a fortuitous event. It happens that at that time, I was in search of my own identity. I wanted more than anything to find a philosophy to adopt as a guide for my life. It was then that I had the opportunity to participate in a series of meetings with the famous anthropologist, Carlos Castaneda. According to my notes, I had my first meeting with Carlos when he came to Mexico to promote his most recent book, The Fire from Within. On that occasion, he gave a public lecture, which I only found out about the following day. I regretted missing it since I had been waiting for an opportunity like that. However, luckily, I was invited to participate in an exclusive meeting, which took place in the house of an acquaintance, where he was going to give a speech. That day, due to an omen, we became friends, and after that, we met on several occasions. In a talk he gave soon after the great earthquake, he was very elated. He said that Doña Florinda had left the world that day. He referred to the imposing person she was, calling her the Toltec woman. He told us how she controlled everyone with an iron fist. Although he publicly declared how much he loved her, my impression was that deep down, he was secretly relieved that she had finally gone. On another occasion, he told us that Carol Tiggs had returned from the afterlife, and that this was a shock for everyone, since they did not expect to see her again. He said that her presence among them had created a new dynamic. Starting from that point, he began to open up to the public. I always believed that the larger group exercises was a strategy of the Nahual woman. On another occasion, due to omens, he told me about the rule of the three-pronged Nahual, and he chose me as the messenger. He said that I should not make it known until 4 years after his departure. I did it in this way, in the manifesto entitled The Rule of the Three-Pronged Nawal, the same book that provided the origin to this series of writings. Thus, through signs and omens, our relationship developed. Once, while we were sitting on the bench on a square, he said he had found just what I needed. He explained that he was sending me to visit the old seers, some evil sorcerers, so that I could have an interview with power. I worried about my safety and waited for the instructions, but they never came. Nor did he ever send me anywhere. In fact, I had already forgotten the matter, until one day, as a strategy, he took me to visit the Cathedral of Mexico, where he introduced me to an indigenous sorcerer. Sometime later, one early morning, Carlos called me on the phone. He said that he had arrived in Mexico City, but that he felt very sick. He asked me if I could go for some medicine, the only thing that could help him, which was prepared for him by an herbalist who lived in a nearby town. I did what he asked, and the trip to that town changed my life forever. This is when I met the healers. It happened on that occasion that, due to the circumstances, the spirit wanted me to go hiking in the middle of the hills in search of medicinal plants. Once there, I was almost killed by a band of herb gatherers who claimed the territory as their own. They beat me and left me dying in that place. However, it was the power's will that it was not my end, because I was found by a healer who cured my wounds and took me as her apprentice, the Nawal woman, Doña Silvia Magdalena. Only with the passage of time could I understand how sorcerers play with the lines that shape things, so that what they want to affect comes out as they intend. So I cannot affirm that Carlos prepared things beforehand, so that the things would happen as they did. But I'm sure that it was his intention, because it turned out that the sorcerer he had presented to me that day in the Cathedral of Mexico was none other than my benefactor, Don Melchor Ramos, the leader of the group of healers. Although I can't say that these healers followed the same tradition that Carlos describes in his books, the final goal is certainly the same. I mention it because in Mexico there is a great diversity of lineages, of those who seek power and wisdom in so many ways, and for reasons that are not always enlightenment and freedom. Part 1. The Apocryphal Stories of the Nawal. Carlos used to tell endless stories about his personal history. He changed details blatantly every time that he told them to different audiences, no matter if there was anyone present who had already heard that same story told differently. The result of using this strategy was sometimes fun, sometimes disastrous, since it generated in some of his listeners the conviction that he was an inveterate liar who only sought to deceive people. He even used to give information about the teachings that seemed contradictory, in a way that made many people feel confused. For example, if when recapitulating one should breathe from right to left, or from left to right. Also, whenever we practiced the exercises, he sometimes changed movements. Besides not following a very strict order, he did more or less the same regarding his age and nationality, to the extent that nobody ever knew for sure if he was Mexican American, Brazilian, or Peruvian. Today we know that in different places he was known by different names. He used to live alternating lives in which he exercised other professions, different from anthropologist or famous writer. With all these, Carlos wanted to show us that we should fight to be free from social conventions. In a cycle of talks that he gave in Mexico City, I heard how people commented on how the Nahual repeated himself. When I had an opportunity, I asked him about it. He said he had been doing it deliberately, that it was a strategy of the spirit to record certain concepts in people's minds. That day, he was unusually quiet. He seemed annoyed about something. To break the ice and start a conversation, I asked him why he maintained such a system of tricks. It had been a long time that I wanted to ask him about it. He answered dryly that everything was part of the training received from Don Juan. Then he made up an excuse and said goodbye. He left me with a sensation that by asking him about that matter, I had done something inappropriate. However, on the following occasion that we met, he brought up the matter himself and said that all those procedures were part of the art of stalking, just as Don Juan had taught him. If one is not so rigid and does not take himself too seriously, certainly he can enjoy a lot more in his life, he said with a tone of confidence. When I asked him half jokingly how he felt frying hamburgers, he told me how he got to the most bizarre jobs. Frying hamburgers was nothing. Once I was even living as a beggar, he said with a broad smile. Carlos was an excellent storyteller. He had a gift for keeping his listeners magnetized for hours with his talks. But on several occasions, he told stories that contradicted what he had written or said before. In addition, there were rumors among those who were the closest to the Nahual. They commented about details of teachings that they allegedly received from him directly, and they were remarkably different from what had been publicly disclosed. I had also witnessed this. He told me stories in our conversations which I had no idea how to categorize, since they often contradicted the official version that he'd said or written previously. For example, there's a story of how he really met Don Juan Matus. In one of our conversations, Carlos told me that Don Juan himself was the one who gave him the task to write about the knowledge, and that was the reason why he went to study at the university. I interrupted him. I'm sorry, I thought that you met Don Juan just because of your academic activities. He took a moment before answering. For some reason that I didn't understand back then, Don Juan made me slightly change the story of our meeting. I've only told a part of what really happened. Basically, the version in the books is correct, but he didn't let me mention something at that time that would have seemed crazy. Our encounter in the interstate bus station was not accidental. He himself had instructed me in a state of heightened awareness about the circumstances in which I had to be involved in order to get to know him in the daily world. And what about your anthropologist friend, the one who was with you at the bus station? I asked. Do you mean Bill? He served as a witness to the Nahual's plan, and just for that, he earned a true gift of power. So how did you really get to know Don Juan? I asked, full of curiosity. He said that before meeting Don Juan, he had been part of a squad of the U.S. Army. On one occasion, when they were carrying out military exercises in a lonely area of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, he got wrapped up in a problem which put his life at serious risk. As a consequence of a misunderstanding he had with other soldiers, they had shot him in the abdomen. His assailants drove him in a jeep and threw him into a gap between the stones in the middle of nowhere and left him there to die. Then they fled. This was the place where Don Juan Matus, an old shaman that wandered around that solitary area, found him. In his words, years passed before I could remember what really happened to me those days. In my delirium, I thought that I was dead. I saw, as if I was in the middle of a dream, an old Indian who treated my wound. The days that followed were like a hallucination. At that time, I knew nothing about heightened awareness. When I woke up, I was lying on a pile of herbs inside a cave. The stranger introduced himself as a sorcerer and said that his name was Juan Matus and that he was going to try to fix me, but he couldn't guarantee anything because my condition had been serious and that my chances were slim. My recovery was slow. During that period, Don Juan maintained me exclusively at levels of heightened awareness. He said that finding me in such a condition was an omen that indicated to him that he should take charge of me, and that for that reason he was going to teach me his secrets. Then he explained to me who he was and what he intended to do with me. Incredibly, I understood everything he said, and without thinking twice, I accepted his offer of freedom. When I asked him why he was helping me, he told me that he was doing it because it was a command of the Spirit. Since both of us were the same, I said nothing, however. In my mind, I considered myself more important than an Indian. As if he could read my mind, he told me amid laughter that he was a seer and that we were equal in the sense that sorcerers form lineages, and that a lineage is made up of cyclic beings whose energy presents similar patterns, and that was the reason why we were the same. That doesn't mean in any way that those who arrive are reincarnations of warriors of other times, but rather they present the same energy patterns as those, meaning that they have the same energy configuration as their predecessors. If we observe carefully, we can see that this is not such a crazy idea after all, since we can attest to that. In fact, there are similar people in the world. That is an effect of the rule of the Nawal. Later on, Don Juan realized that my luminous structure was actually different from his. When he saw that I had only 3 compartments in my luminosity, while he had 4, he realized that he had made a mistake. He deduced that the failure had been a design of power, and that meant something of supreme importance. Don Juan interpreted that mistake as a sign to make the knowledge of the sorcerers public. So, master strategist that he was, he designed the perfect plan to bring that knowledge to light. He did it this way because he knew that my energy configuration predicted change. Carlos said that when he returned home, he felt a deep shudder throughout his whole being that shook him profoundly. Suddenly, he concluded his military affairs, and his ambition of becoming a fine artist was put on hold. His attention became more focused on studies in the field of sociology, and he ended up studying anthropology at UCLA. Without even realizing it, I kept following step by step the strategy designed by Don Juan until the time when I accidentally met him in that bus station. So, when I wrote my thesis for the doctorate at the university, I was in fact following the plan elaborated by Don Juan, since, according to him, nobody would pay attention if his message were exposed in a novel format or in an esoteric presentation. Another theme that aroused my curiosity was the whereabouts of the Little Sisters and the Genaros. So on one occasion I asked him about it. "Carlos, what happened to the other apprentices of Don Juan?" He ran his hands over his face, inflated his cheeks, and expelled the air with great force. I felt that I should not have asked that question, but to my surprise, he started telling me that they were well and that everyone was still in the fight, taking their world as a challenge. He commented that some lived together and others alone. I remember that it was then that he set me to the task that I myself should take my world as a challenge. I don't understand. What kind of challenge do you mean? I asked. Each one creates their own challenges, he replied. For example, in your work, you could walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, or walk to your school instead of using transportation. But it's absurd, I replied. It wouldn't work. Of course it works, he insisted. That's what the challenge is about. To achieve it, just get out of your home very early, and for sure you'll see that you'll arrive on time. Like the teacher of martial arts who took the world as a challenge, even to wash his clothes, and he did it impeccably. He continued explaining. After the death of La Gorda, despair came over us, and some of us fled to the other side of the world, and we ended up in Finland. I got a hernia there that almost killed me. I had to be operated on urgently. We understood then that there was no way to escape from power because it would find us, no matter where we went. After a brief pause, he continued. Rosa and Josefina lived here in Mexico City for several years. I was very excited. I wanted to know if it was possible to find them one day. He said that they were no longer here, and that at the moment he didn't know where they were. And the other members? I asked anxiously. He didn't give me a direct answer. He just said, they're involved with the specific tasks that the Nahual left for each one of us. After that comment, he no longer wanted to give me more details. However, I heard rumors from others close to him that Pablito was working as a carpenter in the city of Tula, and that Benigno and Nestor had joined a musical group in the port of Acapulco for a while. For a long time, I had been thinking about that matter. I wanted to continue investigating. I even wanted to go looking for them because I was very interested in their vision of what had happened. However, for some reason, I couldn't keep pursuing the topic until the day when I asked Carlos about what the task was that Don Juan had left him. I remember how he looked at me with his eyes wide open and told me that this question was an omen. That was when he took me to the Cathedral of Mexico. Carlos had a very peculiar form of speaking. He admitted that sometimes he took words borrowed from other languages and even invented new terms to express an idea or a feeling in a better way. On one occasion, he said that in general, referring to people, we all live in a collective mental manfifa. I'd already heard him use that term in the past, and although I understood what he meant, I asked him, by manfifa, do you mean mental masturbation? Yes, that's exactly what I mean, he answered dryly. In his public talks, he was usually evasive about the sexual topic. He made jokes in this respect. He said despairingly that each one could do whatever his desire was, insinuating that he didn't give a damn what people do. On one occasion, however, speaking in private, he told me that those who truly wanted to follow the path of the warrior should abstain from sexual contact. Then I asked him, Carlos, what can you tell me about masturbation? I added that I honestly felt excited most of the time. This shows us what kind of thinking you waste your time with, he said with a mocking smile. But immediately afterward, he changed his expression. This is a very serious matter, he said in an empathetic tone. I felt embarrassed, as if I had been caught doing something illicit. Then he looked at me directly in the eyes and added, sex is like a faucet. Every time it's opened, the energy is lost. It doesn't matter if it's in an act with a partner or simple masturbation. The waste is the same. The seers perceive the orgasm as an energy explosion where the luminous fibers get agitated and they make an effort to create a new life. An analogy could be a balloon that blows up until it explodes. The explosion invariably attracts the predators to feed off that waste of energy, since they are always around. The seers say that the masturbation generates self-centeredness, and that the masturbators in general are prisoners of self-complacency that is in fact a disguise for self-pity. It becomes a vicious circle. They lack control over themselves, and for this reason, they don't have enough energy to do anything else. So the cycle repeats again and again. That was a topic of the teachings that disturbed me greatly. At that time, I had a girlfriend and we had plans to get married. With the hope of reconciling my personal interest with the warrior's path, I asked him what his opinion was about the sexual practices of the East. He answered that for the sorcerers, those were aberrations, and that if I wanted to keep going on the Toltec path, I would have to overcome my impulses. The idea of living without a partner was very anguishing for me. So I told him, "But Carlos, in fact, I don't feel that I lose energy. In reality, having a partner makes me feel more balanced, and it helps me to stay in focus." "You're free to live your life as it best suits you," he told me in a severe tone. "Abstinence is only for Toltecs. I commented on it to you because you told me that you want to follow the warrior's path. In fact, your difficulty in advancing is because you're wasting your sexual energy." Then he gave me an ultimatum, saying that if I wanted to continue, I should finish immediately with my relationship, and that otherwise there was no cause for us to meet again. I felt very sad, and suddenly I realized that the path that he was offering was too hard for me. I was pensive and crestfallen. He said kindly that he knew how I felt, since he had gone through something similar. As if reading my thoughts, he said in a sarcastic way that I shouldn't let it bother me because I would undoubtedly survive the lack of sex. Before saying goodbye, he pronounced the phrase that was forever impressed in my mind. "There's more to life than being born, reproducing, and dying. Would you dare to investigate your hidden possibilities?" I went through a long torture. There was a terrible conflict between my thoughts and my desires. On one hand, I understood the words of the Nawal perfectly. But on the other hand, there was the physical and emotional compulsion that made me return time and again to my lover's arms. Today I can see that the Nawal was in the right when he tried to protect me from repeating the history of my parents. It took me time to understand, but there's no other way out, and there's no time to lose. On this particular topic, the warrior mustn't hesitate. If he wants to advance on the path, he has to save energy at any cost, even when this means having to eradicate all kinds of sensuality. Carlos once said, "To reach this state, one has to commit himself deeply. He must be ready to fulfill all the requirements. This is a full-time battle, and it requires all the determination that one can muster in order to carry it out." "What should I do?" I asked. He answered, "One begins to introduce discipline into his life. Without that, it's not even worthwhile attempting it. Then, with the capacity to make decisions and to carry them out, one reaches a higher energy level, which opens the path to achieving even greater realizations. For example, stopping the internal dialogue, dreaming, and being aware of himself." The sorcerers are very cautious with the use of sexual energy because they know that it's the true battery that moves everything. If one is able to take control over his sexual impulses, he'll be free to do everything else. I avoid mentioning this topic openly because I'm aware that the price to be paid is too high for most people, But for those who seriously want to follow the path of the Toltecs, there is no other alternative. They have to charge the battery, because otherwise they'll never achieve anything. On another occasion, talking about this topic, he said that the erotic industry, such as nightclubs, pornography, and all the sexual paraphernalia that exists, is designed for the mind of the predator to keep the humans in a permanent state of energy exploitation. The most incredible thing is that we don't even realize how we're being so completely manipulated by our captors. In this sense, our situation is not much better than that of chickens. I remember that he used to compare the human condition with that of a chicken coop. He said that we have hen houses, gallineros, and that the predators have human houses, humaneros. It's amusing to see that those who think they're rebels, acting on the margin of what's morally accepted, are in fact only following the orders that they've imposed on us. Most of the time, when people think that they're exercising their free will, the only thing they do is obey the programming that the damn predators have imposed on us. This way, people voluntarily provide them with their precious energy. Carlos used to say that the true revolution doesn't mean defecating on the table where you eat, but rather being aware. The rest are all idiocies induced by the flyer's mind. For them, we're the victims, completely predictable and easily manipulated. What we've seen is that people's energy is at the height of the heels. That happens because every time it accumulates a little bit, it feels like sexual desire. And following the orders they impose on us, most people hurry to carry out draining acts, with a couple or in private, when they milk themselves through masturbation. The main reason for people to live invariably, always with such a low level of energy, is in great measure their own responsibility. Since with that kind of behavior, they empty themselves, so they're directly responsible for the deplorable state that they live in. Years later, I brought up this same topic because I'd heard rumors, people saying that he himself was a ladies' man and that he spent all his time in bed with women. He smiled and said that it was an exaggeration. But from his smile, I could see that there was something else behind it, so I insisted on asking him about it. With a certain reluctance, he said, "An apprentice should save his sexual energy, enough to reach the next level. But once he has achieved the control of the energy body, he's free to do with his sexual energy whatever best suits him." He explained that the sexual acts create an energy bond among couples, and that this link can be very useful. In cases in which there's a conscious intent on the part of the participants. He said, "For those who see it from the outside, it might appear to be an ordinary sexual relationship, but in fact, it's a tool that has been used by Nawals of all times. The sorcerers fuse their energy through sex, and in this way, it's possible not only to transmit complete blocks of knowledge to the couple, but also to create bonds for life." I still don't understand it. Are sorcerers able or not to maintain a relationship as a couple? By then, I myself had already gone several years without any activity. He answered, "As I've already told you before, some can, others can't. It's like that because each one is different. Each person has different energy possibilities. And besides, each one has their own goals. So, this is a completely personal matter. The only thing that's required from the apprentice who begins in this path is that he reserves his energy without having any sexual activity until he reaches the energy body. Once there, how he uses his sexual energy is a personal matter. And why you don't explain all this clearly in your conferences? I asked, a little annoyed. Did you already see what kind of people come to hear me? Almost everybody has holes. He gave as an example a woman who helped to organize his events in Mexico. She has great big holes like this, he said, making an exaggerated gesture with his hands. That's why she doesn't get anything I tell her. People's energy barely reaches the height of their big toe. And for them, the only way out is total abstinence. I don't see any other way. My experience is that nobody is willing. However, if any one of them were able to increase their energy level, even a little, they would find the answers for what they're looking for by themselves. The sense of urgency of the warrior. That day, I found Carlos in a very pessimistic state of mind. He talked about the terrible social and economic conditions that we lived in, and everything because of the limitless greed, the stupidity and corrupt political leaders' brutality. They see the world exclusively through their personal importance. He expressed his dislike of the coarse manipulation of which we're all victims. He finished speaking about what he called humanity's fateful destiny. We're fucked, he said. I looked at him inquiringly. He continued, as if it wasn't enough to be plagued by entities from other worlds, we still engage in destroying ourselves. As a race, there's almost no more hope for us. Soon we'll be extinct, like the dinosaurs. He continued, for sorcerers, everything comes in sequences of 3. For that reason, they pay special attention to every event that happens previous to some decision or at key moments because they consider them as maps of intent that indicate the tendency of what's going to happen next. Then, with total indifference and without considering personal gain or convenience, they accept or reject the propositions of the Spirit. I've seen that. Indeed, sorcerers take the rule of the 3 very seriously. They use the succession of events as an indication of which direction matters are taking. A warrior doesn't leave matters unconcluded, nor does he leave loose ends. So, giving continuity to the tradition, here I fulfill this requirement of sorcery. This way, we close the cycle. Based on this, Carlos continued, if we analyze the history of humanity, the conclusion is that we're irremediably lost. I'm talking about mass extinction, the end of the human race. Those words shook me greatly. I asked him if he, as a seer, had seen the end. In answer, he said that it wasn't necessary to be a seer to know what awaits us. As an example, he mentioned the First and Second World Wars. He even prophesied the day of our end, telling me with an Argentinian accent, "You have very little time, Che. If I was you, I would start to work like crazy." He concluded by saying, "The truth is that I'm happy that I won't be here to see it." All of a sudden, I was caught up in a rational fear that became an obsession and then turned to panic. I thought that the world was seriously about to end. In fact, at that time, I advanced a lot in my recapitulation work. When I commented about the prophecy of the Nawal with some companions, they made fun of my credulity. For some time, I resented the effect of the trick that Carlos played on me, passing his paranoia along to me. But later I realized that it was that feeling that took me across the threshold. It was the strategy of the Nawal, which gave me the push I needed to acquire a true sense of urgency. The saying, "Don't leave for tomorrow what you can do today," gained a true meaning for me. I realized that my curse had always been procrastination. My life was an endless string of unfinished things. I found in my notes a discussion in which Carlos spoke about something else, about the sense of urgency. The sense of urgency is a feeling that one develops and trains, just as one can train their senses of smell, hearing, or taste. It's no use running around blindly from one side to another, as you do. That doesn't count. Simply because that's not the sense of urgency that I'm talking about. For people to live intensely is to have many activities, always running around in a hurry, getting entangled in an infinite number of superfluous relationships. No, for the warrior, the sense of urgency is to get connected with intent. Everything else is unimportant for him. The warrior's urgency is not the same as that of the common man, he emphasized. For them, to be urgent means to hurry, to increase their possibility for personal gain. Whereas for the warrior, the sense of urgency is an internal pressure that forces him to act impeccably. Trying to understand what I was getting into, I asked him, "Does that feeling generate some physical sensation?" One feels it like a pressure that comes from the bowels. That feeling is something that can happen little by little or suddenly. Responding to another question, he told me, "Only the true awareness of our death can give us the necessary push to acquire the sense of urgency." Think of it this way. If we're going to die, we've already lost everything. Then we're free to do whatever we want, even to take a risk in order to pursue our dreams. The big disgrace is that nobody believes that they're going to die. At least not today, not at this moment. But this is an illusion that weakens us, because when we believe that we have time, we leave everything to do later. First the small things, and then matters of life or death. Only the awareness of our pending death can lead us to act impeccably. Only this can give us the big jolt that forces us to act. As long as we believe we're immortal, we don't move. In the end, all that counts is how impeccable we are in our day-to-day life. That's what determines whether we can keep going or not. Looking directly at my eyes, he said, "Do you know that there's no guarantee that we'll finish this conversation alive?" I felt a chill in my spinal column. I said that I agreed with him, but that to have the constant idea of death in my mind always made me feel apprehensive about everything in my surroundings. He said, "The only way of acting is knowing that you've already died. If you can achieve that feeling, then everything falls into place. Only by acting impeccably can you overcome that obsession. Our doom is to believe that we'll live forever, that we have all the time in the world, when in fact, we don't have it at all. For that reason, the warrior lives each second as intensely as possible. He permanently stays conscious of the touch of death." In the beginning of our relationship, whenever we came to the topic of impeccability, it seemed that the discussion had come to an end. So I asked him again to clarify the concept. He said, "Impeccability makes us focus all possible attention on the details. It forces us to be aware of everything we think, speak, and do, 24 hours a day, without a break. In fact, after abandoning our natural laziness, we get so used to living in the flow that we no longer accept any other option. Once Don Juan told Carlos, "Stop procrastinating, change." To which Carlos replied that perhaps he didn't want to change. Don Juan answered that he didn't understand how it was possible that he was dissatisfied with his life, and yet he refused to change. The difficulty of those who opt to follow this path is that they don't have enough energy to make decisions, and in the end, all they have left is stories of what others have done. Like Carlos, each one of us goes through the same difficulties, and all that's required is the determination to make the initial decision that could change the course of our lives. Among the sorcerers of Don Juan's lineage, there was a discussion about why they do what they do, and the answer was that it was due to the fear of death. They maintained that the fear of death is what impels us to keep going in a straight line. Others had the version that the love of life, not the fear of death, was what impelled them to keep going. But it's not the same thing. Warriors know that only the shadow of our pending death can give us the necessary stimulus to stay on the path. Sorcerers say that urgency is a position of the assemblage point, and that once he reaches it, one can notice it because the person's glance changes. One feels that something different is happening from the point of view of others. That person exudes determination. It was astonishing the changes that happened in my life. Once the sense of not having time invaded me, the urgency took possession of me. By carrying out deliberate acts of will, one breaks the vicious cycle and starts to gather energy. As a result, the person begins to feel an unusual trust in himself. It is like a professional that dominates his field completely. He knows in advance what to do without worrying about situations that may arise. For me, this change happened in a gradual way. As the desperation of not having time possessed me, little by little I started to break free of my moorings. And that finally led me to acquire the desired sense of urgency. Once there, I took a turn of 180 degrees in my life. The most remarkable, immediate result in this mental state was that I stopped hesitating in making decisions. In the same way, that also helped me to stop being the shy and distracted person that I had been all my life. I became more alert. I stopped foolishly wasting my energy. And through concrete strategies, I start to manage the saving of my energy in a more intelligent way. The sense of urgency, of being alert all the time, makes us never waste even a single minute, he said. But that doesn't imply getting desperate or being obsessed by anything. Rather, the sense of urgency is like a pressure that forces one to proceed impeccably once and again, creating in this way a chain of impeccable moments. In fact, the warrior surrounds his life with impeccability, making of it a work of art. It doesn't matter if one is working, resting, or carrying out any other activity. The important thing is to do everything with full consciousness of every detail. A good way to reach that state is to be aware that what counts is not how much or how fast you do things, but how well you do them. Carlos once said, "If instead of wasting my time looking at the ceiling, I had studied piano, I could already be a concert pianist by now." What he meant by this is that we all waste our lives in superfluous activities such as watching television or sitting down in front of the computer for long hours. It's necessary to be very careful about how we use our time. If one isn't careful, one can end up as an addict or obsessed by activities that can deviate one from the path. On another occasion, he said, "The warrior makes an effort to be productive, creative, and if possible, revolutionary in what he does. A warrior is never in a hurry and never wastes his time. For that reason, he's always occupied in reaching for something, avoiding something, or achieving something. For the warrior, life is an endless struggle, and he accepts with humbleness his place in the battle. He wages his war with all possible force, fierceness, and passion, because he knows that he's fighting for his life." Don Juan imbued me with the warrior's urgency. He made me see that only the awareness of our death can give us the push that we need. He once told me, "Only he who is already dead in the daily world can have access to the world of the Nawal."